Hi, I'm George Norrie, and welcome to our Coast to Coast AM YouTube channel. Have fun, tell your friends, and share us with everyone. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Coast to Coast AM's mobile app. And always remember to log on to our website at coasttocoastam.com for daily articles, the best paranormal information, and all you need to know about your favorite guests. And now you can become a Coast Insider directly through the Coast mobile app. We welcome our international listeners and even offer a free 2-week trial. So don't delay. Become an insider today.
On the topic of creatures, monsters, cryptids, things that shouldn't exist but seemingly do, seen and reported all over the world for centuries, things like Sasquatch, dogmen, werewolves, Mothman. Are they something more than folklore and legend? How can they possibly be real? Dr. Simeon Hein is the director of the nonprofit Institute for Resonance in Boulder, Colorado. That institute is devoted to the study of subtle energy sciences, including remote viewing, crop circles, and related subjects. Dr. Hein has a Ph.D. in sociology. He taught research methodology at Washington State University, first learned remote viewing back in 1996, and then subsequently became involved in crop circle research. He travels in interesting circles, I can tell you, and is a colleague of names that we know well here, physicists and others, on the cutting edge of science and UFO research. His new book is Dark Matter Monsters. Simeon, great to have you here.
Yeah, hey, George. Thanks a lot for having me back again.
We'll start with this. I mean, you say in this book, you've looked at crop circles and UFOs, and as I said, you're colleagues with a lot of well-known names in these kinds of fields, but you're a relative newcomer to sort of cryptid creatures, right?
No, absolutely. It's a topic I didn't know very much about before just a few years ago.
And you would not have given it a second thought? I mean, other than it's folklore, that's kind of interesting, but not something you'd research.
Well, like a lot of listeners to this show, I used to listen to Lauren Coleman when he was being interviewed by Art Bell years ago, right? And I just had in my mind, it was kind of set that at least Bigfoot, and I didn't know about any other creatures back then, that Bigfoot was some sort of undiscovered bipedal primate that was confined to the Northwest. And I think Lauren had said back in the late 90s, if I'm not mistaken, that there were maybe a few thousand of them or 1,500. I forget the exact number. And it was something I had seen the Patterson Gimlin footage before one of the movies I saw as a, teenager back in the 70s. And I think because I had believed that this just was some sort of, undiscovered ape, that there wasn't much to it in terms of the subjects that I was used to, remote viewing and other phenomena that seemed sort of transcendental or related to quantum mechanics or something like that. So it wasn't until recently that I really started looking at it. And I'd have to say, George, I encountered many witnesses since about the year 2000 in the Boulder area, people in Colorado that took my remote viewing classes. And these cases started to build up. I mean, I heard more and more from these people, but it wasn't until a few years ago that it finally clicked about what could be going on with this subject, and I saw it was just much bigger than I thought it was.
The U.S. government was secretly investigating what you'd call paranormal phenomena along with UFOs.
Right. Your book with James Lukatsky and Colin Keller, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, I mean, that really kind of blew it open for me. You could see the connections between these topics just talking to the witnesses and reading witness accounts. But in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, your colleagues document that it was the folks at DHS and other places that felt like it would really have negative effects on their organization to be associated with the types of topics associated with Skinwalker Ranch, the types of phenomena. And if that's correct, what Lukatsky says in the book, that they said, we don't want anything more to do with it, which isn't surprising, but this is what we've been going through since Roswell, isn't it?
Yeah. You write about the word paranormal, which is how these kinds of creatures have always been categorized. It's paranormal, which sort of just puts it in a box and shoves it off to the side. Yeah, quaint legend. Let's move on. But you have a framework of an idea that maybe paranormal isn't the right word to describe these things.
Paranormal just means it's next to what we consider normal, and that is basically up to social definition. Social definition, thankfully, changes every few decades or so. And I'm sure it's going to happen with these topics also. You just have to go back in history and look what we consider to be supernatural, quote-unquote, paranormal, and it's ordinary things that we're used to now, like electricity and magnetism and even, physical vacuums inside bottles and things like that, that were really considered strange many centuries ago. It really has to do more with our mindset than the phenomena themselves.
You're talking about life forms, as you write, life forms based on non-ordinary states of matter that science has yet to fully recognize. Draw that out a little bit. Explain us what you mean.
Right. Well, if you start looking at the witness encounters, and certainly what you mentioned in Hunt for the Skinwalker, and then Lukatsky and the rest of you continued in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, we're not just talking about some encounters with flesh and blood creatures. It's not what the witnesses report. Even your witnesses from Defense Intelligence Agency, which Lukatsky goes into great detail about what they experienced at Skinwalker Ridge. There are these same phenomena showing up again and again, including orbs and sort of strange space-time sensations and feelings of fear, and sort of seeing these creatures apparently defying gravity, winking in and out, appearing there one moment, then the next moment they're gone, and even having telepathic communications with you inside your head, which a lot of people have experienced, especially around Bigfoot. And that, to me, just suggests, since that is so similar to the other phenomena that we associate with the paranormal, that we're dealing with the same underlying phenomena here, and it has to do with another state of matter that we're not all that familiar with, but I would have to say I think goes back to the research and the work of Bose and Einstein in 1924 when they came up with the Bose-Einstein condensate, which wasn't discovered until 1995, shown to be real, right here in Boulder, Colorado, just a few miles from where I am. So, it takes a while for these scientific discoveries to be accepted, to find the data to show that they're real. And then we look, hey, where else do they show up in our lives? I think we show this kind of coherent matter, as it's known, not just in Bose-Einstein condensates, which only appear, near absolute zero, but in ordinary settings, ordinary temperatures and situations that we encounter day to day. And that type of matter, it doesn't behave like matter we're normally used to. It has these very strange, what seem to us as strange characteristics, but, it's there.
These creatures, different cryptid-type creatures that we're talking about, seen all over the world throughout human history in one form or another. We've called them by different names. You focus, example, on Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and yeah, of course, they are seen in the Pacific Northwest in forested areas. They're also seen in deserts. That makes absolutely no sense for a creature that big to be able to walk around in the desert. It's been seen at the Nevada test site, which has virtually no cover at all. How does that make sense?
No, that's a very good point, because if you look at some of the more traditional Bigfoot research, and I'll just mention this as an example, David Paulides, his book, Koopa Project, his book, Tribal Bigfoot. He starts these books in a very methodical, empirical way, and he's trying to correlate these Bigfoot sightings. And he says they're correlated with bear sightings, they're correlated with rainfall, and with forests. And that is true in terms of the witnesses he's interviewing. But when you look at it in a bigger sense, you see them in Arizona. I've talked to people who have very good encounter stories from Arizona. Not a lot of forest going on there. At least the Bigfoot sightings are not just in the forested areas. So if you look at the patterns of where Bigfoot, Sasquatch are seen, it doesn't fit the normal patterns that you would expect from a typical flesh and blood animal. It completely defies the boundaries and sort of the distribution that you would expect from an animal that we're familiar with. And it shows up around nuclear test sites, nuclear reactors, especially, Stan Gordon's work, Silent Invasion, Pennsylvania. It just doesn't fit. And that's why, I'm looking at this over the last couple of years saying this is not a typical sort of mammal. This is something that's really coming from somewhere else. Exactly where, we can talk about, but it doesn't fit the pattern that we normally see if you're looking about distribution of animals and typical sort of physical, organisms.
You write about Bigfoot in your book, Dark Matter Monsters. There came a moment, sort of an epiphany for you as you're traveling, and you run into a Sasquatch outpost. Talk about that moment.
Yeah, well, that was really exactly right. That was a seminal moment for me because someone had told me about the Sasquatch outpost, which, is run by Jim Myers and crew in Bailey, Colorado. And I have to tell you, George, I'm here in Colorado. I had heard about these sightings from people I knew. They had told me what they had seen and experienced. And some of them wouldn't even tell me about their encounters till I really pressed them because, as you know, these encounters can be traumatic for people and they don't want to talk about it again. But I'd heard about these encounters, but I was traveling with a friend through Bailey, Colorado one day. And I just said, let's just go down another street before we exit back onto the highway. And there it was, the Sasquatch outpost. A friend had bought me some socks from there years ago, the Bigfoot socks. So I knew about the Sasquatch outpost. And I said, well, we've got to go into this. There's a huge image of a Sasquatch on the side of the building. It's a museum and a store. And so I go into the museum. My friend actually stayed outside. She wasn't all that interested. And what really struck me wasn't just all the images of Sasquatch, the artist paintings, and these are sort of models that are really huge and so forth. They have a much bigger model now, which I got to see a few weeks ago. But it was the map, George. There was a map of all the Sasquatch Bigfoot encounter sightings within a radius of Bailey, Colorado, stretching out into my area of Boulder all the way to Estes Park. And I'm looking at this map, and it's like, wow, there's like hundreds of encounters, people hearing the wood knocking sound, seeing tree structures, footprints, and what we call Class A sightings where they actually see one of these creatures or encounter them close up. And I realized there are hundreds of them within about 50 miles of Boulder. And all of a sudden, it just sort of sunk in that this was a hidden event, something that you and I talked about 5 years ago, previously when we were talking about black swan ghosts. We were talking about hidden events, why things happen, and people don't talk about them. All of a sudden, I realized this is another hidden event. People are experiencing this in the Rocky Mountain area, and they're not really talking about it very much, but they're going into the Sasquatch outpost. They're sharing their stories with Jim Myers and other people who work there, and they're putting the pins in the map where they're having their encounters. And that means this is actually much more widespread than we're led to believe.
Well, UFOs have always been not so respectable for scientists, people like yourselves with PhDs to dig into, but that taboo is sort of breaking down over the last couple of years. I suspect that the same thing could be happening with these cryptid creatures, in effect, because of changes, new discoveries in science that you go into in this book. I think we won't have time to dive into the whole theory, but that in general, what you've described in Black Swan Ghosts and Opening Minds, your previous books about changes in science have sort of ushered in a new era where we can look at these topics in a different light.
Right. Every century or so, we reevaluate reality as a society. And thankfully, our ideas of reality do change, George. And they changed 500 years ago with Copernicus and Galileo. And these things switch from being fringe to very respectable. All of a sudden, everyone wants to be part of it. And that's what we're seeing here with UFOs. I think it'll happen also with cryptids.
Dr. Simeon Hein is my guest. His book is called Dark Matter Monsters. We'll jump back into some of the specifics and the framework for the science that he thinks explains how these creatures are not only real, but live among us on a regular basis. we're talking about mysteries that have been seen over the entire planet throughout human history, maybe even before recorded history. Creatures, cryptid creatures that seem impossible. Bigfoot, wolfmen, werewolves, things of that sort. Mothman, throw that in there as well. Dr. Simeon Hind has come up with an idea of how to explain these things, not necessarily paranormal, just normal in a sense that we don't understand yet. We're going to jump into some specifics, what he means. Simeon, at the top of the program, I mentioned, I don't know if you were listening, but I mentioned the anniversary on this date in 1955, the infamous Kelly Hopkinsville series of events where these beings appeared surrounded this family. They were shooting at them, and these things would get shot and then pop right back up. I mean, it is on its face just preposterous, so ridiculous that no one could possibly believe it. And those kind of things happen when you're investigating what we call paranormal. They're seemingly ridiculous on purpose, almost to challenge our beliefs. Is it designed that way on purpose, some of these events that we're about to jump into, or it just happens?
I don't know if it's designed that way on purpose. I think if you take the Jacques Vallée approach to this, you might argue in that direction that it's designed to change our awareness, slowly over many years to help us evolve. But I mean, I think the other point of view is that when you're dealing with life forms that are based on other sorts of principles than we're normally used to, it is going to seem ridiculous to your mind because that's a defense mechanism that it has. It's a way for it to deal with it. I mean, the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter it's something I've wondered about for many years. And glad you brought that up because that would sort of fit into sort of the phenomena that, I'm looking at in dark matter monsters. So.
Yeah, I mean, you get into statistical probabilities, how unlikely something might seem just based on what's been reported before. I'm just thinking about cases where, investigators, researchers are pursuing something, investigating it, trying to figure it out, and it's not cooperating, because we think we're the top of the food chain. We can figure out how to hunt something down, like a Bigfoot, but not necessarily. If it's smarter than us or it has instincts that we don't have or abilities, then figuring it out, hunting it down is not as easy as we might assume.
No, that's right. And these types of intelligence, they're going to just have a kind of a broader kind of perception of space-time than we have. And I think it's what you're saying is we've always assumed that we're the most intelligent thing around, right? The top of the food chain. You see people say that all the time. There is an assumption we're the apex predator, we're the cat's meow, the bee's knees, right here on Earth. It's us, right? I mean, that's a belief we've had for thousands of years, but maybe it's not true.
You get into examples of Bigfoot, Sasquatch cases that seemingly have abilities way beyond just an undiscovered ape out lurking in the woods. Can you share some of those with us?
Yeah, well, the last time I checked, typical primates and apes don't communicate with you telepathically, right? In so many of these cases, people say that they hear them talking inside their heads, and they don't know what to make of this. And it's not always a normal sounding voice. Some people describe it as a muddy sounding voice. Some people describe it as sounding mechanical or computer-like. But the reason it's so unsettling is that it seems to, just as you mentioned a few moments ago, it seems to be anticipating what they're about to do next. I remember hearing about a case recently where the woman said, she saw the doorknob turning on her rural house. I think it was in Tennessee in the Smoky Mountains. She thinks about going to get the rifle in her bedroom, and she hears this mechanical sounding voice in her mind saying, "Don't bother to get your gun. It won't do any good against us." This normally doesn't happen with the animals that we're used to. And the other phenomena, of course, are these creatures seem to be able to slide and glide over the forest. They seem to be able to disappear just instantly when they're right in front of you. I mean, this has been witnessed by multiple people at the same time. And they seem to be able to throw orbs of light at people or turn into orbs of light, which is really fascinating. For me, one of the big connections to crop circles. I ran into someone recently in Boulder. He said, "Hey, Simeon, the last time, we talked, you were into crop circles. Now you're into Bigfoot." And he's British, and he said it in a very British way. It's like, are you just putting your finger in the wind and following the latest, fad? I said, no. I said, Andrew, there's the same things happening that we saw around crop circles, especially, George, think about it, camera failure, battery failure. This has been documented many times at Skinwalker Ranch, but people experience it. I've talked to witnesses in Colorado who told me they heard this kind of strange sounds. They went out and looked. They saw what they thought were some Bigfoot. All of a sudden, their phone dies. People have said that their car batteries have failed temporarily around Bigfoot. Other technological failures that are very similar to what you get around UFO encounters. And that's why I brought in the NICAP report from Gordon Lore, Strange Effects of UFOs, and Donald Kehoe, right? Where they go into the same sort of effect. Now, when I'm looking at this, and you're seeing the same effect, whether it's cryptids, UFOs, or crop circles, or even going back to remote viewing, because we know some of these same phenomena happened when they were studying Uri Geller, one of their first subjects, target put off at SRI. Some of these same phenomena happen. You just have to ask the question, are we dealing with the same underlying phenomena here that manifests itself in different ways? Are these really all different aspects of the same phenomena? And in dark matter monsters, I'm just making the argument. Yeah, I think you can make a reasonable argument that this is all the same phenomena. It has to do with different states of coherent matter.
Can you describe in a little more detail about the kinds of other phenomena that happen in association with crop circles? The public now believes that these are all made by people with boards sneaking out into a field in the middle of the night. But there's a lot more to it, and you've been there to see it yourself, right?
Yeah. Actually, George, my gateway drug was RV, because it was because sometimes you do targets like crop circles, and this is one of the targets that I did as part of one of the classes I took back in 1996 at the Farsight Institute, and I really wanted to know what is a crop circle. I had the RV session I had done, but I wanted to get some verification, so I went over the next year in 97 on a crop circle tour, and what I found immediately was that people were reporting camera and battery failure around crop circles, orbs, and strange space-time slips that we're all familiar with now. But back in the late 90s, that was like entirely new to me. So I kind of got hooked on these crop circles as sort of, as you're saying, kind of a avenue or a gateway to these other phenomena. And I began to see it myself in the group I was with my own cameras, camcorders. You could see this repeatedly. And then on doing more investigation, you would find that it had happened to professional camera crews that had come out there to film documentaries, including, BBC, National Geographic, and other, big production companies. They would say their camera stopped working, and seriously stopped working. I mean, the whole thing would be so scrambled. I heard in one case that the BBC had to completely reboot one of their $25,000 video cameras. They had to call London for instructions how to reboot the camera. They'd never done this before. Now, I've seen this myself sometimes 3 or 4 times within the space of half an hour of cameras, batteries stop working as people walked into these crop circles. So when I found out this is happening around Bigfoot too, I mean, not every single time. And, I know a lot of researchers out there will say, I haven't seen this amongst my witnesses. But if you listen to the accounts, a great set of books by Cutkin and Renner, Where the Footprints End, where they talk about these sort of phenomena around Bigfoot and cryptids, you start to see the same patterns there, and you really have to wonder, what is it about these phenomena? You wouldn't expect your batteries and cameras to just start going on the fritz around any old animal.
Where Footprints End, is a great title. Also, an interesting phenomena. There are a lot of cases in association with Sasquatch where the footprints are followed. First, they pop up in the middle of nowhere, not some player that's created by pranksters or hoaxsters so that you'll find it. It's literally in the middle of nowhere. Dave Paulides has cases where you're following the footprints and they just end as if these creatures, whatever they are, vanished into the sky. There are cases like that involving Skinwalker, of course. What do you make of those? What does it tell you that these beings are able to do something like that?
Yeah, it raises a lot of big questions, doesn't it? I mean, and Jonathan Dover talked about it, the Navajo Ranger, recently on some podcast. He said he was an experienced tracker. I mean, he's out there in the reservation. And then somewhere, actually, I worked in college. I worked on the Navajo reservation, so I kind of knew what he was talking about in some of the locations. And he said, you would see just, as you saw at Skinwalker Ranch, they would go, come to a barbed wire fence, and the tracks wouldn't even seem like they were perturbed by the barbed wire. And then he said, you're following it farther, and in muddy ground where you should have seen the tracks, they just stopped. And Dover said it was like something just picked them up into the sky. And that, to me, suggests another type of matter than you and I, again, are usually familiar with. It's just able to shift phases from a solid form into perhaps an energetic form or another form where it doesn't have the same weight. And this is the real strange thing about it. If you have something that seems as huge as Sasquatch, where people describe them being 600, 800, 1,000 pounds, I mean, they can be as high as 12 feet or more and as wide as a barn door, according to the witnesses. Absolutely huge. So, something that looks like a bodybuilder, with a fur coat on. You would think something like that is that heavy and does leave footprints. I mean, this is what Grover Krantz originally studied. He was just upstairs from me at WSU when I was getting my PhD at Washington State University in Pullman at the time. And he had tons of footprint casts, as I've come to know now. I didn't know him then. And they have these footprints at the same time the footprints end. How's that possible?
The other part of this is that you discuss the possibility that these things can make themselves invisible, or that they're around us all the time, invisible. We just don't see them. Camellia was the name of a book that discusses how humans are developing invisibility technology. And give us your take on that.
Right. Well, it's certainly, I think, something that a lot of people would consider very unnerving, to think that you're out and about doing what you do during the day or at night, and that you could be being observed by creatures, intelligences that, can become invisible. But that's what science tells us is possible. John Ramirez, the former CIA missile signals intelligence analyst, talked about it not too long ago. He called them dark plasmas, and he said that the KH-1 satellites would detect these orbs coming into the atmosphere. He mentioned it, obviously, in terms of Soviet missile tests. But what he said that really struck me was that they had a dark mode, an invisible mode, where you'd only see them in the infrared. And the Lockheed Martin patent, which I mentioned, in Dark Matter Monsters, I mean, They're talking about coherent matter wave beams, a type of quantum phenomena based on something, Raha-Bohm effect, a type of quantum effect, where they say right in the patent, which actually the patent office took about 10 years to actually give them the patent. They gave it to them in 2021. They're talking about creating invisibility as a sort of, military application. So you've got these different sources telling us that invisibility is something that's already, scientifically real, perhaps something that we could be doing with our own technology. Wouldn't it, it's not unreasonable to think that other types of life on Earth may have already mastered it before us. Again, another huge kind of ego buster, but that's certainly a real possibility here. And I think it's consistent with the evidence from Bigfoot, Dogman, all the other cryptids that, we're familiar with now, that I've become familiar with. They talk about this invisibility. Well, if Lockheed Martin is doing it or proposing to do it, and John Ramirez is talking about it, something they've observed from these, KH-1 and other page satellites, then why wouldn't, biological and other types of life already figured out how to do it a long time ago? I mean, we wouldn't see them, so we wouldn't have known they've done it. But, that's what people report they experience.
So coherent matter phenomena, your idea, sort of as an umbrella term to explain how different life forms could exist in this space, just separate from our own reality. Is that right?
Right. Coherent matter, George, would be the fifth state of matter. We're familiar with, solids and liquids and gases. And then beyond gases, we have plasmas, which are ionized gases, which actually make up the bulk of the universe, according to my research. Plasmas would be fluorescent light bulbs and lightning, which we're familiar with. But much of the universe is sort of gases and illuminated energetic dust out there. And, it creates luminescence and light. We can see it. But beyond plasmas is a type of self-organized matter where the particles are like in a macroscopic coherent state. And that's the next state of matter. That's what the Lockheed Martin patent has to do with. This is what a Bose-Einstein condensate is, and we've known about that for 100 years. The only difference, I'm saying here, and a lot of other researchers, and again, this gets into a lot of different areas, including LENR, cold fusion, and those subjects, is that it can happen at room temperature also. You don't just need to go down to absolute zero like a Bose-Einstein condensate. Lockheed Martin, right at the beginning of the patent, if you read it, they say, we can do this at room temperature. And
right.
We can create cloaking, invisibility, teleportation. People have reported these Bigfoot and dogmen seemingly being in one place, then it's over there, then it's over there, like it's just jumping from one spot to another, like they're teleporting around you. And yet, here we are reading the Lockheed Martin patent. They're saying, hey, we're going to do this for you and much more. So, another state of, it's a quantum state of matter.
Simeon, let's talk about dark matter for a moment. You make the point in your book that, science is pretty sure it exists. Science is pretty sure it makes up a big chunk of our universe, but they can't find it, can't see it. Why is that related to what you're describing with these cryptid creatures?
Right. So dark matter is, it's hypothesized to be a type of matter that interacts with ordinary matter, but we can't measure it directly. It doesn't have any electromagnetic signature. And according, to the model that science currently has, dark matter outnumbers visible matter by like 10 to 1. And this is discovered, again, about 100 years ago, Fritz Zwicky and others who just noticed that there wasn't enough visible mass to explain the rotation of galaxies. Dark matter is what's hypothesized to hold, galaxies together, since there's not enough regular mass to explain it. And then there's dark energy, which is a whole other type of energy that pushes galaxies apart. Well, in researching just topics like cold fusion, what's now called low energy nuclear reaction, this is something I've been interested in for about 10 or 15 years, just because it's another type of scientific topic that has been suppressed because it doesn't fit mainstream ideas of science. I think Coast listeners will be familiar with the Canadian inventor John Hutchinson.
Sure.
Yeah. And he's someone that could produce these very interesting fractured metal samples at room temperature, where it seemed like the metal would melt and even coins would be embedded in the metal. But this is all done at room temperature. And he was able to do it with his recreations of Nikola Tesla's technology, right? So in looking at that and some of the research around cold fusion, I found out about this from the work of the nonprofit Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, Bob Greenyer, and other volunteers that have been working to recreate this technology, that there are a lot of other researchers that have been looking at the same sort of phenomena. Ken Shoulders, who also worked with Hal Puthoff at SRI, he was looking at John Hutchinson and his fractured metal samples, and he concluded that they were the work of ball lightning, tiny micro ball lightning. Ball lightning doesn't just exist as something that's, a macroscopic sort of phenomena that we see after thunderstorms, a couple feet or a couple inches across. What Shoulders found is that it existed at a micro scale, what he called exotic vacuum objects. And there's another researcher from Japan, also someone we didn't hear about, Taki Matsumoto. You can find his recently published papers on Amazon. Matsumoto concluded the same thing, not hypothetically from extensive work. He's a nuclear physicist at the University of Hokkaido. And he discovered that cold fusion is actually a type of micro ball lightning at a subatomic scale, tiny ball lightning. And this is what explains John Hutchinson's results, is that if you can compress matter enough, it'll actually form this coherent matter that we were talking about in the last episode. It'll form ball lightning where all the particles, unlike the particles that we see around us right now, wherever you are in a room or a car, wherever you're at, where all the particles take on different properties and different frequencies. In ball lightning, they're all coherent. All the particles, the electrons, for example, would be at the same frequency, same temperature. And that creates this sort of what Matsumoto called electronuclear collapse, where the electromagnetic forces are so strong when the matter comes together that it literally transmutes matter from one element into another, and it temporarily can deform the materials, and it makes the metals and things that it's around not physically hot, but soft to the touch, like you would expect if it was at a really high temperature, but at room temperature again. So the big connection here to these topics is what Matsumoto found, and this was also echoed by the work of Russian researcher Alexander Parkhomov, is that it's a part of what makes up dark matter, so-called relic neutrinos, the neutrinos from the original Big Bang, just a second after the Big Bang, that really are around right now. They interact with us. The wavelength of these relic neutrinos is large enough that it interacts with cells, it interacts with molecules, and it's what can propel something like cold fusion to be the self-sustaining reaction that it is. So the connection here is that what we call cold fusion, low-energy nuclear reaction, according to these researchers, is actually perpetuated by one portion of dark matter, just a small portion, 1 or 2%. But a lot of researchers, even those who don't believe in cold fusion, agree that these relic neutrinos make up a part of dark matter. And because their wavelength is large enough to interact with cells and molecules, they can sustain these reactions at a subatomic level. And it's actually called inverse beta decay, but it actually creates a chain reaction. And this is what was missing in the argument the whole time of what could keep the reaction going. Cold fusion turns out to be a resonance reaction, almost like a musical note that creates a type of coherency. And these relic neutrinos, from this point of view, coming from the cosmos, are what sustain that reaction. And it's not just something that's like an esoteric sort of process, George. It's actually something that sustains life as we know it, biological life, lots of chemical processes. It's part of nature. And the big takeaway from this for me, from reading Matsumoto's work, is that what we see going on at a large scale in the cosmos with the formation of stars and neutron stars, which are a type of compressed matter, and eventually black holes, actually occurs at a microscopic scale in cold fusion LENR. It's actually ball lightning and very small scale black holes, and the whole thing works together, and it just keeps generating a sustainable type of energy. Now, why we haven't heard about this? Because anyone who's gotten involved in this area, as coast-to-coast listeners know, has been persecuted and harassed and, really pressured to stop researching this.
The public is trying to come to grips right now with this new understanding of UFOs, UAP. You mentioned about the CIA information that invisible orbs are coming into our atmosphere. They're able to detect them even though they can't see them. People are going to have a hard time getting their heads around that. They're going to have even a harder time getting their heads around the idea that there are these invisible beings all around us all the time. There's Bigfoot and dogmen and mothmen and different kinds of creatures that up until now have been mythical that actually live in our reality. We just can't see them. I think people are going to have a hard time with that.
Yes. I completely sympathize with that, George. I'm having a hard time with it. It's not like I wanted all this to be true. It's just where the science leads. It's not like a popularity contest where you're looking for the likes you get on it, or even that you believe in it. It's just, where does all the data, where does it point to? And, if we're attempting to simplify things to a reasonable extent, not oversimplify, but saying, if some of these phenomena are connected, what's the science behind it? This is where you end up. And I share the same feeling that other people might have. I actually, when I go in the woods now, I've been hiking for decades out west. I love going into the mountains. And when I was at the University of Arizona, I would take off every weekend into the hills around Tucson. Believe me, I'm thinking about this too. But what this suggests is that there's other things around us, and we're just going to have to get used to it. And we need to find a way to interact with them, I would say, in a more positive way. But they're real. And just like the UFO topic took a lot of people by surprise since the 2017 news articles that came out. But we're finding a way to deal with that. We're having congressional hearings. I mean, I know a lot of them are still classified. It'd be nice if they're a little more open, but it seems that there's a process around that. I would expect the same to happen around cryptids eventually. There is just no way this many people are having these encounters, and we shouldn't be talking about it as a national issue, just like UFOs and UAP.
Well, with UFOs, go ahead.
What's that?
I was going to say, with regard to UFOs, so if their technology allows them to do the same things that these cryptid creatures are doing, coming into our reality, they're invisible sometimes, visible, they're here, they're not here, it suggests that maybe they're not necessarily extraterrestrial, that they live here among us as well, like these other animals.
Right, and I think that Hal Puthoff suggested this just a couple of weeks ago in his ultra-terrestrial article, right? Yep. And that's certainly an alternative hypothesis, that they're not, maybe not all of them are extraterrestrial, that they're indigenous to the Earth. And, surprise, surprise, we just don't see them that much, or just some of the time. It's a real, I agree with you, it's a real adjustment to, but it's consistent with the idea of dark matter. I mean, think 10 to 1. There's realities right next to us right now, all of us, that we don't see and we don't interact with directly, except part of the time. When it sort of, the frequency changes, it kind of manifests itself at our frequency range of physical matter. And we are coming to the idea that maybe this is some sort of indigenous life forms technology to the Earth. And I think the same will happen with cryptids.
So with UFOs and cryptid creatures, lumping them together for a moment, we see them and then we don't see them. Are we seeing them when they allow us to? Or is it accidental, incidents where we come across them and, oh, gosh, they're surprised kind of a thing?
Well, it seems to be a mixture of both. If you look at, and Stan Gordon is someone you kind of asked very early on in the show here how I came across these topics. I did hear Stan Gordon talk at one of the UFO conferences, perhaps about 10 or 15 years ago, in your hometown in Vegas. And I didn't know what to make of it. George, he was talking about this wave of UFO sightings and cryptid sightings in Pennsylvania, southwestern Pennsylvania, in the early 70s. I remember Stan Gordon's lectures very well. And he was the one who said, you don't just get one or the other, you get both at the same time, at least in some of the cases he's looked at. You get waves of UFOs, then you get cryptids the next night. And then some people see the cryptids in the same field as the UFOs. I mean, what in the world is going on with that? Again, to me, it suggests that there's some sort of, change in the physics of reality. It's not just psychological, and the physics of the space, the phase space, where all of a sudden it's visible to us. And I'm not sure it's just because they're intending it for them to be visible to us. I think we're changing in some way, too, that gives us a broader range of perception. Of course, that's what remote viewing would be about, is perceiving a broader range of reality. So I think sometimes they do seem to show up to appear in front of people, but other times it seems like you get these waves, and they're just there, and you have, people happen to be in the same space that they are, whatever they're doing.
I want to ask you one question. You've, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, you've traveled in some interesting circles. You've got to know many of the major figures in UFO research, I think probably because of remote viewing and the connection there. And you've made some pretty strong statements about crash retrieval programs, metamaterials, analysis of things that have been picked up at crash programs and sites. Can you elaborate on that, what you know to be true and what you think is coming?
Yeah, it was Stephen Greer, who we all know, who said something that I've never forgotten. He said, you can meet people at dinner events, at conferences, that will give you more information than you'll ever hear from a congressional hearing. And that's what's happened to me, is going to many conferences over the years, and not just in these topics, George, just ordinary conferences where I'm invited to speak about, ideas about parallel realities, multiverses and things like that. You run into people that feel comfortable sharing their stories with you. I'm sure you're familiar with this. Sure. And they want to share what they've experienced that they maybe don't feel comfortable telling to other people. And I've encountered very high-level people who handled UFO materials. They're scientists that would have the know-how to look at this very carefully. And they've told me they're absolutely convinced this is not any material. Some of it was very large. One piece in particular, the person said it was about 3 or 4 feet across. You could see the curvature of it. That would even give you a feeling of what the whole craft looked like, since it was a piece of the hull. Anyway, this particular individual, who never really wanted to come forward after talking to me, but described this in great detail, said that it's absolutely impossible that this came from Earth. It's just made from different isotopes. It's made in zero-G environment. And we don't even know how to make microtechnology at that tiny nanoscale yet. And he said he would know because he had been involved in making some of the smallest scale technology that exists. So, yeah, you do run across these people, and they tell you stories, and you wonder, when is this going to hit the mainstream? Why is it me? Why am I hearing the one about this? And it builds up after years. Also, people who've been in the military will tell you stories at these conferences and say, well, I'm not comfortable with you repeating that. And I have some of those stories in the book also. But you come back to them and say, look, I think the public needs to know about this. This is important for us to have a discussion about this topic. If I change some of the details and leave out some of the specifics, sources and methods and all that, can I mention it? And they'll eventually say, okay. So, yeah.
Can you use remote viewing to look at something like UFO incidents, Bigfoot sightings, crop circles, things like that?
Yeah, you can. It's just that you can use RV for a whole bunch of different uses, and it's fun to use it on those topics. And I've done it many times, and I've done it with our groups, our training groups. What you're lacking is verifiability, and I like to stick to targets in my training classes that where you can verify the target at the end, just so that you can see what you got and what you sort of made up. And if you're viewing a target where you don't have feedback from it, you can't really do that. And even Ingo Swann used to say he didn't like targets where he couldn't get some verification.
Yeah. Mars, the moon.
Really
right.
Yeah, so we all love doing those targets, and people say, can you RV this and that on the moon or Mars? And it's fun to do, and we do them sometimes. I've got another training class coming up soon. People like to do this. But I like to stick to verifiable targets just because I think you learn more that way at the end of the day. The other ones are very interesting, too, but they remain, as Stanton Friedman would have said, in the gray box,
Right. Simeon Hein, Dark Matter Monsters is packed with a lot of interesting stuff. I know at the end of the book you say, hey, this is my theory. If you got a better one or if you got input, let me hear it. Yeah. And I hope you'll come back and share with us once the book gets out there and circulates more about alternatives or additional information that comes your way.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks very much, George.
Thanks.
I've enjoyed it, and thanks for everyone for listening. Yeah, I'm always open to another interpretation, but this is my best take on it.
It's excellent. It's a lot of fun. Thanks, Simeon. Appreciate it.
The Coast mobile app is now available for download on iPhones and Android devices. You can become an insider directly through this app. This is a great option for our international listeners, and new users will also receive a free 2-week trial.